So welcome everyone to our first career panel. And I'm Ashley Chu. I'm here from the University of Toronto, and I have the honor of moderating this discussion with some pretty fantastic people. Not all of whom I've met before, but just based on their bios, they're clearly going to have a lot to tell us about how they ended up working in the areas that they worked in. And we're lucky to have people representing a variety of different areas. So we have someone from a private company, I think Esri's private, some people who work for government organizations, and someone who works at a university. So I guess I'll just start by why don't I just get you to introduce yourselves? You can maybe pass the microphone down. Just maybe tell us a little bit about who you are and where you work now, and briefly about your background and sort of how you ended up where you are today.
Oh, great. Thanks, Ashley. Can you hear me okay? Yes, thanks everyone. I'm Alexander Watts. My nickname is Sandy Watts. You can call me Sandy. I'm actually the industry manager for public health at a company called Esri Canada. I'm not sure if any of you have ever used the software called ArcGIS, so a GIS software. Esri is sort of the company that actually produces and develops that software platform, ArcGIS. And so sometimes I wonder how I got to this position. It's a new position. It's kind of a new, it's like a new program, I would say. And it's really about building capacity in the public health community across Canada in using spatial analysis, intelligent maps, location intelligence, and improving and helping out our public health system with spatial analysis. And in terms of my background, I started into way more of a, I guess, quantitative background. So my background is in academia. I did more research. My PhD was, again, spatial epidemiology and infectious disease ecology. So a lot of spatial modeling and spatial statistics and very quantitative. But yeah, I did a flip right after my PhD. I worked at Blue Dot, which I think some of you might know of here in Toronto for about 6 years, where I kind of moved maybe more away from the quantitative side into sometimes program and project management and even sort of strategy. And that's kind of what led to me in my current position, working in more of a strategic role, far less quantitative, but still dealing with a lot of quantitative projects. So anyways, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Hi everyone, I'm Jessica Stockdale. I'm an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in the maths department. I'm very new to the position, so hopefully I can give a bit of an early career researcher perspective today. I mainly work in infectious disease modeling, surprisingly enough for this event, and genomic epidemiology. Alongside my position, I'm also theme lead for data analytics and modeling at SFU's new institute, PIPS, so that's the Pacific Institute for Pathogens, Pandemics and Society. Tying in my infectious disease work there with work into the more like social determinants of health. Prior to my current position, I've been a postdoc and then a senior postdoc at SFU since 2018. Working with Carolyn Colane, and before that I was back in the UK doing my PhD there in stochastic epidemic modelling at the University of Nottingham. Been working on COVID stuff mostly for the past couple of years. During my postdoc I was seconded part-time to the BC Centre for Disease Control to work on COVID modelling. And I think I'll stop there.
Hi everyone, my name is Aamir Fazil. I'm chief of the risk section at the Public Health Agency of Canada. My background is actually I'm an engineer by training, so you may wonder how I ended up in public health. It's, I think what you'll all find is that your career journeys tend to take twists and turns, and you end up where opportunity takes you, and that's what in fact happened in my case. My thesis was focused on essentially infectious diseases in water treatment systems. As an engineer, we were working on that sort of general field, and that topic then sort of led to opportunities opening up in looking at risk assessment for microbial pathogens in food systems. From there, I ended up at the agency, well, it was Health Canada at the time, but eventually became the agency. And primarily till COVID, our focus was on vector-borne diseases, foodborne pathogens, enteric pathogens, and developing mathematical models to look at the spread of those pathogens through those systems. February 2020, I was actually sitting in one of these chairs right here at a Fields meeting. I think Ashley was in the audience, and we were discussing essentially a new infectious disease in China at the time, and how we might prepare, and what the Fields Institute and the scientists around here might be able to do to help the agency respond. As we all know, a few weeks later, everything changed, and our group at the agency became responsible for all of the infectious disease modeling related to COVID that you might have seen coming out of the agency. And, you know, it was, so right now we have essentially expanded significantly in terms of adding some capacity to be able to address it, because what we found obviously is that we didn't have enough infectious disease modelers within the group at the time to really address the issue. And so, yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. My name is Venkata Duvvuri. I'm a scientist in machine learning in the Public Health Ontario. I joined in January 2022. So my background in education is I did my PhD in public health epidemiology and then moved to Canada. So I sat here so many times, and I was a postdoc with the York University, Jianangu. And later I moved to Public Health Ontario as a temporary positions, and I spent a lot of time on 2009 H1N1. And then when I reflect myself what I'm doing, so infectious disease modeling, and also given my biological background, I started exploring bioinformatics and genome analysis. That really gives me another edge of how could we better utilize and integrate the genome data with non-genomic data sets. That's why I started working on. So 2009 H1N1 gave me a platform to work, do such kind of work. And then I did my master's in immunology while doing my postdocing to do some epitope analysis in the lab. And then I moved to PHO. I mostly spent 5 years on the molecular surveillance and epidemiology of infectious diseases. So later I realized when I'm doing there, I realized that having a core skills of public health would be good for me. So I did my part-time MPH from U Waterloo. Then while I'm looking at what's going on the outside, and also, a lot of data is piling up, and also modeling is coming up, machine learning is coming up, then I really started my venture into the continuous education with the coding side. Then I became a data scientist in the Seattle Institute for Systems Biology. I spent a lot of time on the COVID EHR data and integrating with the multi-omics data sets, and we did a great job there. So then I became a principal data scientist in a public health company based in California. Then I moved here this is my 9th month going on here. So currently I'm establishing now, given my background in the applied genomics and also machine learning, so I'm trying to establish applied genomics, like phylogenomics of infectious diseases in PHO, and also how well we incorporate the data science and machine learning into public health area. Yeah, mostly for the lab side, how best we utilize the data sets we have, genomes and non-genomes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. So I guess the first question I wanted to ask you, and also I think I'll ask a few questions, and then if people have questions that they want to ask, please, I'll maybe ask the audience as well. But I guess the first question I wanted to ask you is, what is, recognizing that we have a bunch of people who are trainees right now and maybe thinking about what their career looks like, what is one skill that you acquired during your academic training that you think is essential that you still use in your job today? And then the flip side of that, what is one thing that you didn't learn in your academic training that you wish that you had learned? And sorry, that's a good question. Is there anybody who wants to start who's not Alex, whom you're just like?
Yes, my ideas.
I think the skill that is probably most needed in the field right now is the ability to sort of communicate to a non-technical audience. I think that would be, and I think you probably are learning those skills just by having to sort of give presentations, etc. But that's probably the biggest sort of weakness I find in terms of it, especially technical people coming into the field, the ability to convey complex mathematical models or infectious disease models to what unfortunately tends to be the primary consumer of your products are not necessarily technically inclined. And so translating that into, in our case, policy making or decision making inputs is critical. I think what I didn't learn that it would be important is the ability to actually sort of manage people. Ultimately, you will be managing, whether it's students or co-workers, etc. The ability to manage people in a, I guess, in a way that doesn't sort of build hierarchies of I'm your supervisor or I'm your manager, but rather, especially in this kind of field, it tends to, you need to have a much more of a collegial kind of collaborative kind of management style. I think that is probably the biggest.
I totally agree in terms of communication. I mean, I'm still working on this. I think we're so embedded, we're so trained, especially if you came from a modeling or statistical background, that you have to explain every parameter and the limitations of each parameter. It's like, it's such a skill. So I'm always working on that myself. But one thing I have really found more recently is maybe coming from a PhD background. I did my PhD, like one building over in ecology and evolution at UMT here. It's kind of like project management. And I didn't realize I was actually getting that when I was doing my PhD, but it's like an independent ability to say, okay, I have this huge thing I have to do. And it's like, I'm accountable for completing that project to some extent. So like, how do I break that down and manage my time and make that happen? Maybe even build a team to do that. It's something I acquired and didn't realize I was getting that from my PhD, but like that is really becoming handy now. It's just saying, okay, then we have a 3-year, maybe 4-year project I have to build out, and how do I break that down? So but even a master's PhD experience like allows you to acquire that management capacity. Something I wish I honestly had, now that I'm working way more hand in hand with public health, is like poli-sci. I wish I knew more about the realities of politics, being involved in health systems in Canada. And I used to think, oh, like I've built this amazing model and they're totally going to use this model and their policy is going to be great. And it's like a totally different world. So that's the reality check I think I've seen now working more hand in hand with public health is, oh, there's a whole system I don't even understand. And the nuances of budget. I mean, honestly, budgets is what it comes down to, and budget cycles. So yeah, if I were to do it again, I would do maybe a little minor in poli-sci. Health economics.
Can I add my points? Like, I completely agree with both of you. Apart from that, what I learned from the academics, that writing skill is very important. Like, you do research, but you have to you can communicate orally, but writing is very important. Like when you're developing like manuscripts or proposals, that's the one thing I learned. Apart that, what I did not learn, when you are doing your academics, like mostly your focus is completely narrow. Okay, so we don't see what's actually going on at the big picture. That sometimes I felt, sometimes I feel I stuck somewhere because I never see that overarching, what's going on there. So I see what I'm doing well, I'm doing great, but why I'm not getting what position I want, right? So then I really realized that I started reflecting, okay, what are my strengths? I'm doing well everyday work. What are the weaknesses? Then I started looking at the weaknesses where you can able to prioritize. Okay, do you need any core skills to meet your goals, or do you need any mentors? Like, so there are some mentors, they really help you out. Like what I felt from the mentorship is also, you don't go and discuss your research with the mentors. Mentors they will give you a kind of strategic idea, like how to how to shape your career. That's where I really learned, I had a kind of, I always say that, this is what I'm doing. So my mentor said, hey, excellent, you're doing great, but it's not really giving me anything. So then I realized why I'm not even having a couple of meetings, why it is not happening. So then I realized that no, science, I can handle that science, but I need to learn something, how strategically make my life, to meet my goals. That's what I did not learn from the academics, but I learned from by looking at many people and understanding what's really going on. Whatever research you are doing, maybe that may help some point, but you need to see what are the realistic way. Like suppose if you see the infectious diseases, they are growing, data is growing. So what needs we need, like they could be our core skills in the next future, right? That's where I'm just building, and that's why you see my career path. Always a continuous learning is there always while I'm working. So.
Yeah, I think, well, some similar themes to what everyone's spoken about definitely coming up. I think for me, something I wish I'd done more of is that the written communication to know how to sell my work, exactly the stuff that Morgan was just telling us about, grant writing, how to also in papers and things like that. I think it's something that doesn't come very naturally to me to speak about what it is that my work can do and why it's great. And I wish I'd practiced that a little bit earlier. Something I'm happy that I kind of did start earlier. I guess I'd go with a more kind of technical direction as a modeler. I'm happy that early on in my research career, I did like some very kind of data-driven, statistical focused projects. And I think that has really helped me as a modeler later on to kind of have some idea of what's feasible, what we might be able to get from data, where the limitations come in. I think it's tempting if you're getting into modeling to always put everything in your models and say, can we have the most accurate representation of life that we can do? But often that doesn't work out very well because of limitations or just computational problems. So yeah, for me.
Great, thank you. I was wondering, I just wanted to pick up on something that Venkata, you said. You talked about having a mentor. Do you have any advice for people who are potentially looking for someone to mentor them, or similarly are looking to be mentees to other people? Do you have any advice in terms of like how to find a mentor, for instance, which I know can be very challenging?
That's really excellent question. Suppose we call it always, networking is important. What is the networking means? Like talking to people, saying hello. No, that's not networking. You need to have a kind of active network. You should establish kind of a long-term relationships with those people. So how I developed in my life, so I normally say, okay, this is my interest, where I'm going. I reach out to the people, like those who are already established there. I said that, okay, this is myself, and I'm looking for this one. So then having a kind of a chat with them, then I can say that I'm happy to collaborate or happy to join on any project going on with you. Not for the pay, just to build the honest, and also the my skills there they will learn, and also that's how I normally slowly build my long-term relationships. Now I have almost 6 to 7 mentors. Even still, when I'm taking up this position, also I talk to them. How do you see this pattern? This is like different mentors and different agencies and industry, and they really shaped my life. But I'm not saying they are not good at directors. They will tell us what they are understanding from the big picture, so that you can assimilate and then think about how well it fits. Sometimes some mentors will give you something which may not exactly fit to your needs. Just respect and ignore it. That's what I understand. So making long-term relationships is very important. So you need to show your interest towards that. So because they are giving their valuable time.
I think it's a very difficult thing to do. It's easy to say that you should get mentors, but I think it at least coming from the science field, you typically will feel very awkward approaching people. You almost feel like, are you using someone, or So I've actually struggled personally to actually, for my career, find mentors as you described, that are just there to give you advice on how to improve your career. I think my experience is starting with my, my graduate advisor would have been my initial mentor. So that was completely focused on the technical side of it, but using that as your stepping stone to, because typically, professors at a university would have a lot of networks of their own. And so you can use that as your initial sort of gateway to identifying people who either might be interesting to you from a scientific perspective or from their career perspectives, and use that as your first stepping stone. In all honesty, I think some of the social networking tools that we have available to us now makes this thing much easier than, well, I had back then. There was no LinkedIn, for example, and I find, those sorts of tools are a gateway to have those connections potentially open up.
I think sometimes it's hard to think I have to find a mentor or even find a supervisor or whatever. If you just go right to that step, it's like, oh, there are a lot of barriers getting here. I think to just do that immediately. So sometimes I think if you think about it almost in a different way, which is, you're right, expanding your longer term and more genuine relationships with just people in that field or working on that same question or those same projects. So I think sometimes when you are joining, working groups, maybe there's working groups out of a conference or workshops, that turns into maybe a little working group for a specific paper. Maybe you're volunteering for a little group that's a group of students working on a specific, a public health question. There's different ways you can start to just build your own network just by kind of doing stuff outside of your thesis or doing stuff outside of your work. Maybe it's just joining up with a group of students that aren't doing a research-oriented thing, but are just working on this other project. That can sometimes be that stepping stone to not only to a specific means to an end or a specific person, but you're just broadening your horizons, you're spreading your wings, and you're opening up yourself up to people who maybe you didn't even anticipate would be your mentors, but very much end up being people you follow and look up to. So I've always found that joining stuff outside of your thesis can actually be really helpful in just expanding that world to mentorship or not.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think some of the most useful events I went to during my training were events where you were doing something with other people in the field, like interactive events where you just can build genuine relationships without it being so awkward.
Exactly.
What's your research?
Exactly, like the networking events at huge conferences where there's 20,000 people. It's like, oh, I don't even know how to get started. Yeah. So when there's 20 people, it's way less intimidating to just start to say hello.
I think that's great advice. And as somebody who's also struggled with the formal mentor finding thing, I think that's really useful. And I sort of even reflecting on my own network, I think so many of the connections, in terms of thinking about finding employment or opportunities, actually come from former classmates or colleagues who, are actually sort of are very well connected as we grow up and do different jobs. And so I think that's also a really important aspect of, I guess it's not mentoring, but it's sort of that relationships and building those networks is definitely don't dismiss those sort of interpersonal relationships with your classmates and other trainees. Sorry, and that was sort of editorializing. I'm supposed to be moderating. Sorry. I guess, so one of the things that I think is always an undercurrent of these sorts of panels is, I like what you're doing. How do I get your job? Or how do I get my foot in the door? So I'm just going to put that out there in terms of to save people the awkwardness of coming up to you and asking you specifically. If somebody wanted to work at your particular organization, I guess just in terms of practicalities, but also in terms of are there specific skills that they would need to get their foot in the door? And what advice would you have there? Whoever wants to start this, right?
I can, sure. At least, well, at the Public Health Agency of Canada, I think this is probably a pretty opportune time to put in applications. And within the federal government, at least, it's a very structured process in place. So there are, you will find on jobs.gc.ca postings for different types of jobs. What you'll find is that you may feel like there are hundreds of people applying for one job, but the way it actually works is you may not get the exact job you applied for, but a lot of times what we do is build pools of talent. So there may be one job, there may be 100 people applied, one person gets a job, but 20 people are qualified for the job and they sit in what's called a pool for that particular job. Once you qualify for the pool, it means that any other job that opens up within the federal government that has certain skill sets that that job also had, means they can just, you don't have to go, the hiring manager or the person that went through the job application process doesn't have to go through another screening process. They would just look at the list of names, look at the skill sets, pick out the person that has most skill sets appropriate for the position, get the job. So, you know, there is a value in going through what may seem at the time to be a fruitless process, because people tell you, well, it's probably earmarked towards someone who already knows, who's already in the position, they're kind of putting them in there. That isn't necessarily how it works. So there's value in doing that. I think there's also big value in, when you're doing your graduate work, to get involved in projects that might have sort of co-supervisors that are outside the academic sphere. You know, what we find is a lot of the people that end up working, at least at the agency, might have done a graduate project that fed directly into you know, a group at the agency using that information. And that sort of comes back to that networking process, because by having a co-supervisor that is from outside the academic world, they might have opportunities, and that's actually happened a lot in our group. And in all honesty, a lot of times it's also just being at the right place at the right time, and that's where, again, the, you know, spreading your wings, as you pointed out, it just gives you more chances to be at the right place at the right time, because you never know where those opportunities arise. And, you know, in my case, it was clearly, my plan was never to end up where I ended up. It was just a sequence of fortunate events that kind of take you in that direction. So you also have to be a little bit open to opportunities that may not be your, you know, your dream position, but sometimes those dream positions come about from, say, a circuitous.
I think I completely agree with Aamir. I think he covered everything. Yeah. So yeah, that's what, you know, he rightly pointed out that you have to be, some people they get, and unfortunately they fall into that area, you know, where fertile land is there, so that he can grow quickly. Some people may have some roadblocks, and they have to hit them and walk through. So yeah, so he already covered, I think. So, and also what I heard one of my mentors said that if you are applying for any job, don't look at are you perfectly fitting into whatever the job descriptions. Just 20% if you are meeting there, you know, only essential qualification, and you can able to explain when you get a chance for the interview. Just apply for that if possible, you know, so that even though like success and failure, I don't like those words, because how best you walk in the trail is very important. So no, that's what I learned from a couple of my mentors told me, that, you know, don't worry about success or failure. There is no words, like you can't measure anything, so that there's nothing is there. So try towards your goal, like, you know, how best you're putting your efforts, and maybe those efforts may help you out finding out the right spot where you can grow quickly and increase your luck. You know, yeah, there's a factor, is there always some unknown factor which drives sometimes.
I can definitely agree in terms of this idea that, like, from a very direct, when you're applying to a very specific job or a role, yeah, it's so easy to think, oh, like I don't check every single box on that job description. And I don't know if I've ever hired anyone who's ever checked every single box. Like it's usually 60-70%, and you're really looking at like, what does this person bring? What are their experiences? How can they grow into the role? And even for myself, right? Like I've always kind of jumped into something a little bit spooky, something that I'm like, I'm not totally comfortable here. But yeah, it's always taken some time to grow into that role, and I've sort of developed my skills in new weird ways I never anticipated before. So yeah, there's something about this, trying something out that seems interesting is totally worth it. And I've also definitely hired people who applied for a totally different role, and someone recommended them to me because they said, oh, they're not maybe a different person we have in mind, but they might be more suited for your group. I said they absolutely are, and I'm going to talk to them, and we've brought them onto the team. So this idea of applying to a position also means you're getting your name and your expertise into that institution, into that organization, and that's very much shared across departments and within departments too.
Yeah, I'm trying to kind of translate what all
know,
this for academia, and I guess the thing that jumps to mind for me, having just been through the academic interview and hiring process, is that there really were a broad range of things that people, the committee and the people interviewing me were interested in. Of course, your research and the impact of your papers and all the things we expect, but there was also for me a lot of focus on teaching, service, what you were going to bring to the department in terms of, I was asked, do you plan on hosting conferences here? What kind of events and people will you bring to the university? Kind of like a wide range of things. And people were also interested in what I would be like as a colleague. And I think trying to put myself into their shoes and think, well, what would I be looking for if I were interviewing someone coming into this department? Who would I want to work alongside or down the corridor from? That was helpful to me. I mean, because I applied for a job at the same university where I did a postdoc, I don't know how different the process was or would have been if I were elsewhere, but it was really quite a big range of things that people were asking me about and interested in, which I found reassuring and it wasn't just all your top 5 impact papers.
I think what Jessica just said about people wanting to know how you would sort of fit in with the team is a really important factor, because we go through a paper screen where the qualifications of the person look fantastic on paper and their skill sets are amazing, but when you actually speak to the person, their inability to communicate again clearly, or their inability to sort of fill that missing piece in a team is what often makes the decision between candidate A and candidate B. And so, I think that's something that as people from science, we tend to be a lot more focused on the technical side of it and not necessarily on the people side of it. And, I think that is a sort of a lot of times the make or break between people.
I'm going to ask one last question and then I'll open it up to the audience. There's 2 parts. One is short, which is what did 20-year-old you, or like university you, think you would be doing as a career? And sort of building on that, what advice would you give 20-year-old you or university entering you in terms of how your career actually unfolded?
I can start. Yeah, I was convinced I was going to be working in finance. That was, I was 100. I did internships and then I didn't like it. My plan was to live in the biggest city that I could live in, work all the time, try and make money. And then, I had never even considered doing a PhD until 3rd year maybe of my undergrad. I kind of didn't even know it was a thing. And then, I just did one research project in one of my summer vacations and loved it, and have not really looked back from this path. The advice part is harder. Now I wish I hadn't jumped in quite so
But
early.
we can do the, what did you want to be when you grow up? And then we can come back to the advice if you want.
Yeah, for myself, I was not really yeah, it was. Yeah, I can tell you that I raised in an area where filariasis is endemic. It's kind of vector-borne disease area. I was so fascinating how a mosquito can able to give us an infection, and most people, they don't show up the disease until unless you know the symptoms. So that's really bothered me a lot. So that pushed me towards this doing my PhD. Apart from that, I don't know where I'm going and how much I'm going to earn. So that's the only focus there. So very mature.
I guess in my case, I was a classic example of a person who was 20 years old, so I had no idea what they were doing. I was just going from step to step. I ended up in engineering because my brother told me to go into engineering. There was really no plan whatsoever. It was just following guidance, and I was pretty much a lost soul, to be honest with you. I don't think I ever wanted to be an engineer. I don't think I ever wanted to be in a technical field. I don't think I ever knew what I wanted to do. So I pretty much just went step A to step B, and somehow things fell in place. So I don't offer any grand plan whatsoever.
I mean, it's so funny you say it because I think mine was almost the total opposite. I think when I was like 4, I was like, you're gonna be a biologist. You will be a biologist, an ecologist maybe even.
Wow.
It was like very, I don't know, there was something, I read some eyewitness book, I think, and it was like really inspired. So yeah, I mean, when I was 20, it was very much like, you are going to be an academia professor. I think even when I was 20, I was already into infectious disease. I think maybe I was really into primatology and this whole idea of zoonoses and HIV and anything between, this animal-human connection. So at 20, I was like, master's, PhD, academia. That was the drive because my 4-year-old self had decided that already. So yeah, things change.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been on or like listened to a panel where someone was like, I knew exactly what I wanted to do and I'm doing exactly that. So I think that's probably the take-home message here. In terms of, is there any advice that you would give to young youth? And it's okay if you don't have any advice.
I mean, my advice, and it isn't biased because of where we're sitting, I would tell myself to pay more attention to calculus and math classes. I did not. I think when you finish school is when you realize you could have learned so much, and then you afterwards try to struggle to catch up. Maybe it was because I was a lost case that I was just there, putting in the time, but it was almost like I wasted. There were so many opportunities to learn that I wasted. So, my advice would be to learn as much as you can when you're given that.
Sometimes what I have I'm from India, so they're mostly individuals won't lead their life, society will drive it. Okay, so the problem, what I understand, as you mentioned, I missed some of the opportunities because of not really focus. Like when I'm getting into the biology side, so math is actually diminishing completely from my curriculum. So I realized after I completed, I came here, then I realized, okay, so I really again started learning. That's where I submitted many applications and thrown out. They don't know anything. So then it started again. So that's very key point you mentioned about skills in the math. That's what if I remember correctly from Harvard, one professor wrote that even if you don't know anything, learning math is enough for you to find a way. So yeah, so that's what I realized. So that's what I'm telling to my daughter also.
I guess I would think I would tell myself not to be afraid to kind of branch out sideways a little bit more as well. I think some of the most interesting people I met during my PhD were people who totally changed field or went off in directions that you couldn't have predicted. And I was always a little bit jealous that I didn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it was, I think that was maybe when I was 20 or whatever in that time, because I had this intense trajectory I had sort of planned out for myself, and I'm still glad I did that. Like, I think it's been fruitful. I'm sure all of us would sort of say that, right? But yeah, like even earlier, starting to just suspend that plan a little bit and start to sort of look outside of that a little bit more. Like, it's scary because you start to compromise. Well, for me, it was really compromising this like dream and this passion that I planned out for myself. I couldn't stray away from this, being true to that story, that narrative I had of myself, which was sort of like academia, professorship, the romantic idea of like being this biologist in the field with monkeys was so cool. But once I started to suspend that and like think about alternatives, and then even pursuing that and starting to open that world, like all of the really cool stuff started to happen. And even like moving school. So at first, so I did my undergrad at McGill. I was thinking of doing a master's at McGill because my supervisor for my thesis was like, oh, you should just do a master's with me. And I made this decision to switch schools and actually go to Calgary, to Alberta. Right? And so, no, I mean, that was a big game changer because it was new schools. You had to reset. You had to relearn, you know, a different school, a different culture, different science, different people. And then came to U of T for my PhD. So you kind of uproot once again. And every time I did that, as terrifying as it was, it started to kind of open up totally new opportunities every step of the way. And even after my PhD, it made me more comfortable flipping from academia into industry and trying that out, even though it was totally uncharted territory and very different language. You know, I was able to kind of adapt to that in different ways. So yeah, maybe I started to do that, I guess, when I was 20, but I'm glad I threw myself into that uncharted territory. It was terrifying. It's totally worth it.
No, I think being scared is good for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be here this morning. So I've been listening to all the different paths and everything that you have all taken to get to where you are. So my question is, so I'm a master's student in my second master's degree, so I have an MPH already. I've worked a lot. I'm on the fence about continuing on into a PhD because the time commitment, you know, all of that thing. So it's taken me a while to get here. So I guess my question is, in terms of I don't want to say the benefits of a PhD or continuing on in that area, how did you make that decision? How have you benefited in your jobs? Is it necessary? Like, for me, I'm you know, trying to decide the scheme for it.
Yeah, sometimes I say this in terms of like to PhD or not to PhD.
Yeah.
That is the question. It's a big question. Have an immediate answer to that or knee jerk.
I mean, I think it all depends on, obviously when you do your PhD, you do sort of specialize by default. Within the agency specifically, there is a demand for people with PhDs, but the pool of people that are hired within those job classifications is also smaller. You know, so I don't think it's ever a bad idea to get a PhD, but you have to do it understanding that where you might end up, you probably may be more challenging to get that one unique position. So, you know, with an MPH or a master's, there's probably a lot more jobs that you would instantly fall into. But then it becomes, you know, are you going to be personally satisfied doing that kind of work, or would you rather? Are you more, you know, interested in doing? don't say true science, but real, more detailed science, if you will, then the PhD has value in that. So within the agency, for example, we have the National Microbiology Lab. It isn't a wet lab per se. We have within the NML, we have what are called research scientists, and that includes infectious disease modelers, and most of them are PhDs. Within the agency at large, we would have epidemiologists that are primarily MPH or master's level, and occasionally bachelor's, but it's becoming increasingly rare for that. So, I think that's where you would sort of make your choices, at least if your goal was to end up within the federal government, for example. The type of work that you would do as a PhD in the agency would be, very close to what an academic would do. You would be creating new science, putting out publications, serving on advisory committees for other students, etc. But you would be taking also the findings from that science and applying it directly to policy. At an MPH kind of level or a master's level, you would just be taking the information that's provided by science and providing some interpretation of it. So there's a different level of intellectual sort of input that you would have if you took the time to do that. But I don't think there's any wrong answer. I think it all becomes a personal choice. I do not have a PhD myself. Everyone around me has PhDs. And in all honesty, it does become, sometimes there is people will impose an inferiority complex on those without PhDs. After years of experience, then it sort of balances out, but typically then you also have to deal with that. Whenever you're in a science field, there's always, the PhDs will sometimes look down on a lot of PhDs. So if you're comfortable with that, it's also all right.
I can actually just weigh in on this as well. So I'm somebody who also, I did a master's degree in biochemistry, actually. I went back to school and did an MPH and worked for a while, and then went back to school for a PhD. And it was mostly the reasons that Aamir mentioned, which was that I sort of hit a ceiling. Like, I was doing work that I think would have been at a comparable level, but it was basically, the challenge was that, I only had an MPH, and that was not seen as, a good enough qualification to really be credible. And so, I'd have to have co-authors or supervisors sort of vetting my work. And so that was why I went back. It wasn't necessarily, for purely academic intellectual reasons. It was more sort of that feeling in terms of what I wanted to do versus what my credentials made me qualified to do.
Can I add a point here? It's a kind of a general understanding what I understand when I was reflecting on this question. So two routes are there normally. One is like PhD. If you are going to give your 5 years for the PhD, what are you going to learn from that? That's very important. Like nowadays, when you see any job in even your epidemiologist or the modeler, people are looking at do you have skills, data skills. That's very key, irrespective of any job, and unless it is an experimental lab. Okay, that's the one thing. You need to know what I'm going to do in the 5 years and how that is actually related to the current ongoing issues. That's one thing you can think and give your 5 years. Otherwise, after MPH or masters, you can go for a job to the, if you get a nice job in any agency, so that you learn what's going on and exactly you can experience that, right? So then you can give a chance to the PhD, so that you can find a way. At the same time, you can develop your collaborations inside the organizations while doing your work. That is also another way, so that after a PhD, masters, do some work in a PhD or fact or anywhere. If you get it, and then go for a job. So go for a PhD, then you can go for the leadership positions. Now that's what you need to think about those two.
It's always important to just to consider, like, you want to also really love the experience of doing the PhD. It's not just like a box to check. It can be a pretty great and amazing experience, but a grueling experience too. So I always say, like, I make sure that there's also something you really do care about, you really want to investigate, because you're spending a lot of time with that question, that data, or maybe not with that data. So that's a big consideration. It's like, I totally agree that like it does help expand your opportunities, but if there still are, if you're comfortable growing your career in something that isn't necessarily scientific or data driven or whatever, so many opportunities that do not require a PhD for sure. Of course, it's
Are there any other questions? Thank you for this. Thank you for this conversation. It is very nice to hear all the experience from you. And just wonder, as maybe you're in a university or in a company or public health, you need to work with people, and just wonder what kind of people would we appreciate to have in your work? What kind of experience you had, like make you think, oh, I really appreciate that person is in the team, or like such things. Or maybe some people did not find them to work with. What kind of person would you think?
It's all about people. it is exclusively about who you work with at the end of the day. That's how I felt about it. And I think for me, at least, the people I've enjoyed working with and we really built something together are the ones that are critical thinkers, who think critically, not just like follow an instruction manual, and people who really I can trust walking away saying, I totally understand what you need me to do. Give me 2 weeks. I'll be back and we can talk out what I come up. It's always hard when you have someone who's just like, tell me what to do and I'll do it. What are the parameters you need me to fulfill, and I'll do that. I always love people who are excited about tackling something, and I can trust will walk off coming up with something that's creative and innovative. That's always the people I like to work with, who have that creative mind.
Yeah, I want to add, it's my experience, whatever I went over. So I see that, I understand. I'm not giving any opinion, but my understanding was telling that people normally judge you, or some people don't judge you, So sometimes what happens if you don't build your skills, how to encounter those, how to stop them hurting you, your growth and your thinking. So don't worry about what people are thinking about you. That's the biggest thing, because everybody has strengths and weaknesses, right? Somebody has different strengths and we have different strengths. Like even if you reflect on your weaknesses, okay, these I don't have, I want to build them. If somebody actually judging you on whatever the weakness you have, so he identified that. So you have to be ready for that. That's what, normally what we do, if somebody judge you, we will go away from that, right? Kind of shy or something will go away. So we may end up losers, losing an opportunity from there. So I would suggest that, what in that environment, understand what people are actually looking for, how could we better, contribute towards the project goals. That's how maybe people change their judgment again. Especially is actually understanding and learning. So they will give us opportunity to learn also at the same time, when you are ready for working with them, despite having judgments. So that's what I learned and in myself, in my life.
I think in our group at the agency, I think everyone knows the technical side of their expertise. So they're all skilled at what they do. I think the biggest factor that we look for in terms of people that we would like to work with is essentially the things that I think many of us would classify as things that make us good people, if you will, or good friends, or good humans in a sense. Someone who's not going to be looking to steal glory at the expense of the team, someone who is kind in the sense that, you know, when we're faced with outbreak scenarios or outbreak situations, there's an incredible amount of pressure and tension to deliver within certain deadlines. And so you need people on the team that can see when someone might be struggling to meet a deadline and is willing to, you know, take on some additional responsibility to help their colleague out. Someone who isn't necessarily going to be, you know, completely cutthroat in terms of it's me and my career at the expense of everyone else, and so they will sort of backstab and just step on people to get ahead. You know, we always run into these kinds of people, but my experience is that that person might get ahead for a little while by doing that, but ultimately people will often see through that sort of facade, and ultimately that person doesn't end up getting as far as they think they would. It also has a very negative impact on the team as a whole. So you could have a highly functional team of 20 people, and you introduce one person into that team that has sort of less than ideal personal characteristics, that can, it's like a poison pill in the team. It basically will shatter the team. And so that's why when we are looking to hire people, personal suitability is a critical factor that as a manager or as a hiring manager you look for. And that only comes out from, you know, you speak to the person, you give them scenarios. So we have, in the hiring process, we will give different scenarios of, you know, you are faced with a deadline, your colleague comes to ask you for help. How do you approach that situation? So those sorts of scenarios we pose during the interview. The idea there is basically to see that personal suitability characteristic, the characteristic that, you know, in layman's terms is essentially just being a good person.
Yeah, I always think that it's to me it's empathy. Like empathy in the workplace is can be everything, and that can be expressed in so many different weird little ways. But I'd say especially in the virtual world, there's something about empathy where you have to just relate to one another through screens and through connection issues. But you have to be so patient in a way that we've never been tested before. So I'd say even more so these days in your virtual settings, you need to really, you know, you need to work with people who get it, you know, and you're like kind of in it together. Even though I hate that phrase, but you know, you want teams that are actually working together.
I absolutely agree with that 100%. And I think as well, like being, if I'm going to work on a project with someone, being emotionally committed in some way. Like I don't, like if I'm going to work on a project with someone, I don't expect you to dedicate your entire life to that thing, but just the hours when we do work on it together, like showing up, not being afraid to like question the things that I say or say your thoughts, you know, raise concerns. Yeah, just that like commitment.
So, Jen Hong, do you have a question?
Yes, first of all, I want to thank the panelists for coming to the Fields Institute. I'm Jen Hong Wu from York University. My question is actually for general audience, but let me general panelists. But I know Aamir is leading a national network using wastewater for modeling and projection, and Venkata is really trying to integrate the sequencing data with the epidemiological data for the final dynamics analysis, and the same with our colleague from different places, including, for example, Blue Dot. We really have the mobility data and many other things. So the question from what I saw from my students and postdoc is, those are relatively new data. to the traditional training of mathematical modelers and also even to epidemiologists, because those are real new technology and new informations. How I noticed, especially in Fazil, the Dr. Aamir, the team, you have some colleague traditional trained in traditional epidemiology and is so well of getting into the new data. So I just wonder how we can really improve our knowledge to be relevant and to be useful in real pandemic speed. So what would be the agency, the government organization expect if you want to hire some people? Those people really don't have those expertise, but you need them really within matter of weeks, if it's not really days.
I got questions for you here.
That was my fear.
Yeah.
I think the question is, John Hong, sort of what are the skill sets that would be the most important for the agency from the trainees? Is that?
Yeah.
In terms of like pandemic, when you have like very fast responses and lots of data coming that maybe we're not used to using.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where sort of having some imagination available to sort of think outside the box is critical. You know, I think the classic example is sort of during the pandemic, the identification of wastewater data as a key informant for what's happening in the community. So, you know, there's a concept that the lab people identified the wastewater signal as having something, some value, some information being captured in the wastewater signal. But it required the mathematical modelers on the team to understand, well, we can develop a mathematical model that sort of looks at what's happening in the community, how people shed, translate that into a mathematical equation that then can sort of digest the wastewater signal that the lab people are reporting, and sort of fit to that data in order to estimate what the community infection rates are. So, you know, it's nothing that was done prior to the pandemic. It was new data that was coming in rapidly, and it requires obviously some nimbleness to be able to think on your feet, some ability to think outside the box. But ultimately, you know, I think any of the technical fields, and that's what my experience to date has been, is that when you're coming from a mathematical background, any field that sort of teaches you problem-solving skills prepares you for that environment where you're typically, you know, faced with new information, and you have to be able to sort of use your imagination to think how to solve a problem. So I don't think it's gentlemen, I don't think it's an issue of missing skill sets or things that could be trained. I think it's, you know, I think it's all there. In my opinion, you know, I think it is a good time to be graduating from fields with like you are. I think there are now more than ever many opportunities that will arise in public health, at least within provincial, federal, and international levels, to take those skill sets and apply them. Because if anything, I think infectious disease modeling over the past 2.5 years has shown its value to decision making. You know, I think at the CDC, for example, they've got the whole new a modeling hub being developed. The agency, there's a big push to try to develop a modeling hub as well. So there are lots of opportunities for that.
Can I add a point to you? Like, since the genomes, I'm talking from the lab side and the genomic data, lots of genomic data, like 12 million data is there currently, genomes, SARS genomes we have. So what I'm seeing, what we need to equip with the new generations, that how better we translate the pathogen genomes towards the public health surveillance and response. So phylogenomics is the one, it started in the 2004, slowly they have employed to multiple diseases, like since 2009 H1N1, so I worked on multiple diseases on that. So where our input data itself is the time and the genome, the entire genome of the pathogen, so that we're understanding from the host immunological perspective and pathogen evolution, and also structured impact, the epidemiological impacts on the genome. So like the genome consists of that, all those knowledges on that. So the behind tools, if you see the phylogenomic tools, it's like a beast. It's a freely available software. So the behind it is an integrated framework of the statistical evolution and also mathematical epidemiology. So you are not far away from the anything when you are talking about the mathematical like phylogenomics, but understanding the genomics and having that kind of knowledge a little better would be very helpful. I think that's where maybe we have to really think about how better we incorporate that into the curriculum in Canada for the new generation, because genomic epidemiology, when you see, we heard, but when SARS came in, you see CDC and everywhere, genomic epidemiology, like Trevor Bedford from the Fred Hutch, they did a lot of work tracking these variants and everything, but we're not doing any modeling aspects at where phylogenomics. Recently, WHO also mentioned clearly in the report that public health agencies should equip that new application into. So that's where I'm seeing the vacuum. Maybe we have to train people, new generations with that, adding some projects, or adding to the MPH curriculum itself. Yeah. There is a scope is there.
Add maybe a really quick point that also like I'm starting to really see at least in industry, in some research too, like the more and more interdisciplinary teams too. So like everyone comes with something, no one comes with everything. And so I'm seeing more and more data architects, data solutions architects, data scientists, whatever that means these days, but people who really come in with that engineering side too. So it's actually great because, especially in the pandemic, did we see, new sources of data that can be prepared by data architects, and then FAEs working with the data architects to prepare it in a way that works for the model. So there's also, it's great now that there's so much diversity in these teams to be able to really come together and solve these problems and not, hopefully in some cases not rely on one person to pull that all together.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, just to add that the phylogenomics is kind of close to modelers. That's what I'm seeing. Lots of opportunities for you guys in extending opportunities. If you have some, if you're involved in any projects, that's what I perceive it.
Thank you so much, and sorry to cut this off, but we are way over, and it's time for a coffee break. So thank you so much to the panelists for being here today. I think